I watched as he opened the car door for her. A gesture that, before, I thought was just mine. My wife got out of the vehicle, adjusted the strap of her dress and smiled at him before saying goodbye. The man gave a slight wave, waited for her to enter and only then left. But there was something wrong. Something in the way he looked at her, something in the time he stood there, watching. And that's what made me follow that car. My heart beating in my chest as if it wanted to explode, my mind starting to connect dots that I didn't want to believe existed. But something inside me already knew. I already felt the bitter taste of the truth even before it was confirmed. His car drove along the streets lit up at dawn, without rushing, as if it were a familiar route. I followed at a distance, keeping my hand steady on the steering wheel, even though my fingers were sweating. Every corner he turned, every traffic light he passed, it was as if a cruel fate was unfolding before me. And then, he parked. It wasn't a motel. It wasn't a hotel. It was a residential building. He got out of the car and unlocked the front door with the ease of someone who had done this countless times. He went up without looking back, as if that were his own home. My chest felt heavy. My stomach turned. I stood there for a few minutes, trying to find some rational explanation. A friend? A coworker? Maybe he was just leaving something there and would soon leave. But the more time passed, the more I knew. He wasn't just leaving something. He wasn't just passing through. He lived there. And my wife too. At least for a few nights. I climbed the stairs without feeling my feet touch the floor, without thinking about anything other than the need to see, to be sure. When I reached the door, I heard muffled laughter. Laughter that I recognized. Laughter that, until then, was mine. The blood rushed to my head and before I knew it, I knocked on the door. Not a polite touch. Not a request for permission. A punch, a beat filled with everything I was feeling. The silence on the other side was immediate. Then, hurried steps. The door opened and there she was. My wife. Eyes wide, mouth half open. Behind her, he. Shirtless. The messy hair. The smell of lies permeated the air. I can explain, she said. I laughed. A short, dry, humorless laugh. How can someone explain something like this? How can you justify what was already in front of me, wide open, with no room for excuses? I wanted to scream. I wanted to ask since when. I wanted to understand what I had done wrong. But I didn't do any of that. I just looked at her, looked at him and let the silence speak for me. Anger burned in my throat, but something bigger began to grow inside me, the need to turn things around. I wasn't going to beg. I wasn't going to argue. I wasn't going to fight for someone who had already decided to change me. But I would do something she would never forget. Something that not even time could erase. I turned around and left without looking back. But as I walked down those stairs, a plan began to form in my mind. I wouldn't just get rid of her. I would do it in a way she would never forget. I would make her feel the weight of the choice she had made. What came next? That was the most interesting part of this whole story. But if there's one thing I can guarantee, it's that she never imagined that her real nightmare was just beginning. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support and never romanticize betrayal. The stories you will hear are fictional, but they reflect a cruel reality. Betrayal destroys lives, families and dreams. Our goal is to show the devastating consequences of wrong choices and how, in the end, the truth always comes out. Get ready for a story shocking, intense and unforgettable. The lying game has a high price, and today, you'll find out what happens when someone thinks they'll never get caught. Fasten your seatbelts, because this story will surprise you. Daniel and Sophie's first few years of marriage were exactly as he had always dreamed. She was his best friend, his confidant, the woman who transformed any environment just with her presence. Ever since they met, there was an inexplicable harmony between the two, as if they were made for each other. Daniel, a dedicated and ambitious man, always believed that love and effort were enough to maintain a solid relationship. He worked hard to build a comfortable future, to make sure Sophie had everything she needed and, most of all, to make sure she never lacked for anything. She, on the other hand, was a charming, charismatic woman, with an easy smile and captivating eyes. The kind of person everyone liked to have around, who knew exactly how to lead a conversation, how to make any moment special. He was always proud to have her by his side, to introduce her to friends and family as his wife, the woman with whom he would share the rest of his life. The apartment where they lived was spacious and well decorated, reflecting their personalities. Every detail was chosen with care, from the pictures on the wall to the cushions on the sofa. Sophie had a natural talent for making places more cozy, and Daniel loved coming home after a tiring day and finding that welcoming environment. They had a peaceful routine, but full of small moments that made all the difference. Home-cooked dinners, spontaneous laughter in the living room, trips planned with enthusiasm. Their marriage was, in everyone's eyes, a true example of partnership and complicity. Over the years, however, responsibilities increased. The work demanded more time from Daniel, who began to dedicate himself more and more to business. He justified his absence by telling himself that he was doing it for them, for the future they were building. Sophie understood, or at least seemed to understand. She had always been understanding and patient, but little by little he began to notice a subtle distance. Small details that previously went unnoticed began to accumulate. Her look was no longer the same when he came home late at night. Kisses became less frequent, romantic dinners rarer. He tried to ignore it, attributing everything to tiredness, routine, the natural phases of a marriage. But deep down, an uneasiness began to grow within him. Social events were a constant in Sophie's life. She always liked being surrounded by people, talking, feeling part of something bigger. Company dinners, get-togethers, casual meetings with friends, all of this was part of his world. Daniel, on the other hand, didn't always share the same enthusiasm. I liked being there, of course, but I couldn't always keep up with her. He noticed how Sophie shined at these events, how her smile seemed looser, how her energy was contagious. She was a woman who attracted attention, who attracted glances wherever she went. It never bothered him before, on the contrary, he always felt proud. But, lately, something inside him made him observe everything with a different eye. The company party where Sophie worked was one of those events that, in the past, Daniel would have attended without hesitation. But tiredness and accumulated commitments made him give up that night. She insisted he go, said it would be fun, that he needed to relax. But he just smiled and said he trusted her, to have fun and to come back soon. She kissed him before leaving, as she always did, but this time, for some reason, he felt something different in that gesture. Maybe it was just in your head, maybe you were just exhausted and needed some more sleep. Time passed more slowly that night. Daniel tried to distract himself with a movie, but his mind kept returning to Sophie. He looked at his watch a few times, something he never did. He tried to avoid unnecessary thoughts, but the restlessness didn't go away. When the sound of the key turning in the door announced his arrival, he stood up quickly, not even realizing he was anxious. Sophie came in, smiling. She seemed excited, but there was something in her eyes that Daniel couldn't decipher. He asked how the party had been. She responded naturally, told him about the conversations, the toasts, the lively atmosphere. But he didn't mention anything relevant, he didn't give many details, and it bothered him in a way he couldn't explain. She said goodbye with a kiss on the cheek and said she was going to take a shower before bed. That's when Daniel looked out the window and saw a car parked on the other side of the street. The engine was still running, the headlights were on. A man sitting in the driver's seat appeared to be watching the entrance to the building. It was a detail that, in other circumstances, he could have ignored, but that night, he couldn't. He stood there, still, waiting to see what would happen. The man took a few moments before finally starting the car and driving away. Daniel felt a shiver run up his spine. Something inside him screamed that this wasn't a coincidence. He went back into the apartment, but sleep was no longer coming. Sophie got out of the shower, drying her hair, not noticing the serious expression on his face. He said good night, lay down next to him and then fell asleep, as if nothing was out of the ordinary. But for Daniel, nothing seemed normal anymore. Something had changed that night, even if he still didn't know exactly what. He turned over in bed, watching the woman beside him, trying to find some answer in that familiar face. The next morning, he tried to act natural. He asked about the party again, paying attention to her answers. Sophie seemed calm, but there was something about the way she looked away that made him feel a knot in his stomach. He wanted to believe it was just paranoia, that he was seeing things where they didn't exist. But the discomfort persisted. The days passed and Daniel's restlessness only increased. Small details started to catch his attention. Sophie's cell phone, previously always forgotten around the house, now seemed to always be within her reach. The silent notifications, the frequent trips to meet friends, the messages responded to quickly and then deleted. None of this was proof of anything, and he knew he was being irrational, but a part of him couldn't ignore the signs. Until, one night, he saw the same car again. Standing on the street on the other side, the same distance away. The same man inside him. And this time, Daniel couldn't ignore it. Something inside him burned, a mix of fear and certainty, as if his instinct was screaming at him to act before it was too late. He needed to know. I needed to understand what was happening. And that's how it all started. Daniel could no longer ignore the feeling that something was wrong. The routine that once seemed comfortable to him now seemed full of small anomalies, small, almost imperceptible changes that, when added together, created an unbearable weight. Sophie was still the same caring, smiling woman, but there was a distance between the two that hadn't been there before. She no longer looked him in the eye with the same intensity, no longer sought his presence with the same need. Your cell phone has become an extension of your body, always close by, always facing down, always with notifications muted. Daniel didn't want to be the kind of man who suspected without reason, who looked for problems where they might not exist, but every fiber of his being screamed that something was happening. And then he decided he needed to find out the truth. That night, when Sophie said she was going out to dinner with her friends, Daniel nodded and smiled like he always did, but this time he waited for her to go out to get his keys and follow her. His heart was pounding, adrenaline coursing through his veins as he drove a safe distance without letting her notice. Sophie was following a path he knew well, but instead of going to the restaurant where she usually met her friends, she made an unexpected turn and entered a less busy street. Daniel slowed down, staying behind without attracting attention. He saw her park in front of an inconspicuous building, without signs, without any obvious indication of what it was. She got out of the car, looked around, checked her cell phone and then entered through the glass door, disappearing inside the building. Daniel pulled the car over a little further and took a deep breath. His chest rose and fell with force. What did he expect to find there? What exactly was he doing? A part of him wanted to leave, he wanted to pretend that none of this was happening, but the other part, the part that had been screaming inside him for weeks, gave him no choice. He got out of the car and crossed the street with steady steps, trying to remain calm as he entered the building. In the hall, a receptionist looked at him indifferently, without even asking his name or reason for being there. He pretended to look for someone on his cell phone and continued walking to the elevator. On the panel, he pressed any floor, hoping that Sophie had made a mistake and left tracks. When the doors opened, he walked down the silent hallway, watching the closed doors, the metallic numbers gleaming in the dim lighting. He didn't know exactly what he was looking for until he heard it. A muffled sound, a laugh he knew well. Daniel's heart almost stopped. He followed the sound, approached the half-open door at the end of the hall. His breath caught in his throat. There, before his eyes, was the truth he feared, but somehow already knew. Sophie was there, in the arms of another man. A man Daniel recognized immediately. A man who shouldn't be there, who shouldn't have this place in her life. The shock caused everything around to lose sound, as if the world had gone into suspension. He saw his hands sliding down Sophie's body, saw the way she was looking at him, a look he hadn't seen in a long time. She laughed, threw her head back, gave herself completely. And then, as if fate wanted to drive the last blade into his chest, he heard her say something that made his stomach turn. Daniel didn't know how to react. He felt the ground disappear beneath his feet, felt the blood pounding in his head. He wanted to get in there and scream, he wanted to demand answers, he wanted to let them both know what they had just destroyed. But instead he took a step back, then another, until he felt his back touch the cold hallway wall. He needed to get out of there. Not because he didn't want to face the truth, but because, for the first time in his life, he realized he was about to act without thinking. He returned to the elevator, went down to the ground floor and left the building without looking back. The night air felt heavy, as if the entire world knew what had just happened. Daniel got into the car, closed his eyes for a moment and tried to calm the storm inside him. But there was no calm. There was no explanation that could alleviate this. As he drove home, a single certainty formed within him. It wouldn't end there. He wouldn't let that go without consequences. But he wouldn't make impulsive decisions, he wouldn't make scandals. Sophie didn't deserve his tears, his momentary fury. What he had for her was much worse. And then, as he parked in front of the apartment that until a few hours ago had been his home, he knew exactly what he would do. Sophie would never forget what was about to happen. The night Daniel discovered Sophie's betrayal was a point of no return, but the real shock was yet to come. The pain of seeing her in another man's arms, of realizing that everything they had built together had been destroyed, was overwhelming, but it was not enough to explain the restlessness that consumed him. He spent the following days in a state of constant alert, observing every detail, every expression, every word that came out of Sophie's mouth as if trying to decipher something that had been there all along, but that he had never seen. And then, on the night he decided to confront her, he realized that the true weight of the betrayal was not just the infidelity itself, but what it was hiding. He waited for her to get home, sat in the living room, keeping his breathing controlled, forcing himself to appear calm. I heard the sound of the key turning in the lock, the heel touching the floor lightly, the bag being placed on the table. Sophie came in and smiled, but her smile no longer deceived him. He returned the gesture, but his eyes showed no emotion. He waited for her to relax, for her to believe that everything was as before. Then, with a cold and controlled voice, she asked how dinner with her friends had been. She hesitated for a second, but then regained control, inventing details with a practiced ease. He just watched her, noticing the way she avoided looking at him directly. The tension was growing in the environment, dense and suffocating. Daniel stood up slowly, crossed his arms and took a deep breath before speaking again, this time bluntly. He asked if she had something to tell him, something she was holding back. Sophie frowned, pretending not to understand, asking what he was talking about. He laughed, a dry, humorless laugh, and then, with a sharp look, said he knew everything. Her silence was instantaneous, her lips parted, her breathing hitched. Sophie tried to compose herself, denied it, tried to reverse the situation, accuse him of being paranoid, of making things up. But then he described the night of the betrayal in detail, the building, the room, the man. Every word was a blade digging into her skin. She tried to speak, justify, say that it wasn't as it seemed, but Daniel wasn't there to hear excuses. He approached, keeping his voice steady, asking what else she was hiding. Because he knew there was something more. Something that went beyond betrayal. Sophie trembled, looked away, her hands began to sweat. That's when he knew. The real secret had not yet been told. His voice became a whisper filled with suppressed fury as he asked how long it had been happening, how many times she had looked into his eyes and lied. Sophie closed her eyes for a second, as if she knew there was no way out. When he opened it again, Daniel saw the fear in them. But it wasn't fear of betrayal being discovered. It was fear of what would come next. She lowered her head and mumbled something inaudible. He demanded she repeat it. With a trembling voice, he finally confessed. The man she was with wasn't just a lover. He was someone who was part of Daniel's past. An old college friend, a man who was present at many important moments in their lives. Someone he trusted, who had sat at their table, who toasted with them on birthdays and celebrations. Someone who shouldn't have been there, who should never have crossed that line. The shock made Daniel stagger back. His mind ran through old memories, scenes of the three of them together, conversations, laughter, moments when he never suspected anything. Everything seemed like a big theater, a play where he was the only one who didn't know the script. Betrayal was one thing. But being betrayed by someone so close was something he couldn't process. Sophie was crying now, saying that she didn't plan it, that it happened, that she didn't know how to explain it. Daniel clenched his fists, trying to contain the anger that threatened to consume him completely. He wanted to scream, he wanted to destroy something, he wanted to get out of there and never look at her again. But instead, he just nodded slowly, as if he was finally understanding something that had been buried for too long. She approached, tried to touch him, but he recoiled as if her touch were poison. He asked if he was going to leave, if that was it. Daniel laughed again, that lifeless laugh, and said no. He wasn't going away. She was the one leaving. Sophie widened her eyes, confused, asking what he meant. It was then that Daniel revealed the last part of what he had discovered. Before confronting her, he had already taken action. His bags were packed, his name removed from all joint accounts, his lawyer ready. The apartment, which had always been his before the marriage, was now legally beyond her reach. There was nothing left there for Sophie. She started sobbing, she begged, she tried to argue. But Daniel didn't want to hear it anymore. He took the keys, looked at her one last time and said that her real hell wasn't the end of her marriage. The real hell would be what came after. Because her lover, the one she destroyed everything for, was not the man she imagined. And when the truth came out, she would realize that she had gambled everything, and lost in the worst way possible. And then he left, without looking back, while Sophie stayed there, alone, in an apartment that was no longer hers, feeling the weight of a truth that, until that moment, she hadn't been able to see. But she would see. And when that happened, it would be too late. Sophie stood frozen in the middle of the room, feeling the crushing weight of the silence around her. Daniel was gone, but his words still echoed like blades cutting into his skin. Her real hell wasn't the separation, it wasn't the pain of seeing him go. That was what would come later. The phrase repeated itself in his mind over and over, like a warning, like a sentence already decreed. She tried to control her breathing, but each new attempt only made her feel more despair growing inside her. I needed to do something, I needed to understand what Daniel meant by that. Her cell phone was on the table, vibrating with messages that she didn't have the courage to open. She knew who they were. He, the man she threw everything away for, must have been impatient, asking why she hadn't left the apartment yet, why she hadn't responded. But Sophie couldn't move her fingers. Fear consumed her, a fear that went beyond guilt, beyond shame. What didn't she know? What did Daniel discover that she didn't already know? Minutes passed before she finally gathered the strength to pick up her cell phone. The messages were there, an endless string of unread notifications. The first ones were normal, impatient. The last ones, however, seemed different. There was something strange about the tone. She clicked it open and felt a shiver run down her spine. We need to talk. Now. Does he know everything? If you know, we have a problem. Please let me know. This is serious. Sophie's heart hammered in her chest. That didn't just sound like fear of being discovered. That sounded like panic. What else was there? What didn't she know? Before she could think of a response, the sound of the doorbell made her jump. Dread took over his body. For a second, she stood still, staring at the door as if expecting it to open on its own. The doorbell rang again, more insistent. She walked forward slowly, her feet feeling like they weighed tons. When he opened it, he felt the blood drain from his face. On the other side, Daniel was standing still, but he was not alone. Next to him, a man in a dark suit, rigid posture, serious look. Sophie frowned, confused, trying to understand what was happening. Before he could say anything, Daniel crossed his arms and spoke with a coldness that made his bones freeze. "You really have no idea what's about to happen, do you?" She swallowed hard, searching for words, but found nothing she could say. The man next to him formally introduced himself, a name Sophie couldn't even properly process. Attorney. Private investigator. The words were spoken clearly, but their meaning seemed to creep into his brain with a cruel delay. Daniel took a step forward, his eyes flashing with something that wasn't just anger. It was something deeper. "He's not who you think he is, Sophie. And you just threw your entire life away for someone who was about to destroy you too." She felt her legs weaken, she held on to the door frame to keep from falling. "What are you talking about?" Her voice was shaky, almost a whisper. Daniel didn't smile, he didn't show any pleasure in it, because it wasn't a victory. It was just the inevitable conclusion of something he never wanted to find out. "He's a scammer. A criminal. And you, my dear wife, were just another pawn in his game." The silence that followed was deafening. Sophie looked at him, then at the investigator, trying to find a way to deny it, to hold on to the slightest possibility that this wasn't real. But reality set in before she could deceive herself. The man next to Daniel opened a folder and pulled out a stack of documents. "Your lover has a long history of deceit. He seduces women, gains their trust, and when they finally give in completely, he destroys them. You weren't the first, and if it weren't for Daniel, you wouldn't have been the last." Sophie felt the floor disappear. She picked up the papers with shaking hands, trying to absorb every piece of information she read. Photos. Testimonials. Suspicious transactions. Bank records. Different women, similar stories. The pattern was there, wide open. The same seduction, the same promises, the same manipulation. "That's a lie." Her voice was choked, a childish desperation of someone who wants to believe in anything but the truth. "That can't be true." Daniel shook his head, exhausted, too tired to take pleasure in her fall. "Do you really think he wanted you? That he loved you?" "No, Sophie. You were just a path to something bigger. What you have, what we built together, was the real prize. And he was about to make you lose it all." The words went deep, cutting through every layer of denial. Sophie began to hyperventilate, tears burning her eyes, her throat tight with panic. He tried to pick up his cell phone, tried to call him, but Daniel laughed, a bitter, lifeless laugh. "Do you think he'll answer? That he's still here?" "He's gone, Sophie. He's gone. Because now he knows he's been discovered." Her scream was involuntary. A sound of pure frustration, of absolute despair. She threw herself onto the couch, holding the papers to her chest, as if she could erase it if she squeezed hard enough. The investigator closed the folder, satisfied. "Now it's up to you, lady. You can continue to deny it and sink with him, or you can accept the truth and try to save what's left of your life. But one thing is certain, this man will never appear again. He's already doing to someone else what he did to you." Daniel let out a long sigh, his shoulders heavy. He looked at her one last time, and this time, there was no more anger, no more hate. There was just a deep sadness. "You destroyed everything for a man who never cared about you." He turned and left, leaving Sophie there, alone, clutching documents that proved her entire life had been a lie. She wanted to run after it, she wanted to scream, but she couldn't. Because, at that moment, she realized that the pain Daniel felt when he was betrayed was nothing compared to the pain of discovering that she herself had been deceived. And now, she had no one else to blame but herself. The following days were an endless succession of emptiness for Sophie. Each morning, when she opened her eyes, reality came like a brutal blow, tearing her away from the brief comfort of dreams and throwing her directly into the heart of the nightmare she herself created. The silence of the apartment seemed to accuse her, the once familiar walls were now cold and merciless witnesses of the ruin she brought to her own life. There were no more excuses to be made, no more plausible justifications she could use to mitigate what she had done. It was just her mistakes, and the suffocating weight of the consequences she would have to bear from now on. Daniel had completely disappeared from her life. Since their last meeting, there hadn't been a single call, no message, no sign of his existence other than the memories that now seemed more painful than sweet. Sophie understood his silence, she understood his withdrawal, but that didn't make things any easier. On the contrary, his absolute absence deepened the feeling of guilt that was slowly eating away at her insides, like an acid that slowly dissolves everything it touches. It was difficult to accept that the man who had always been by her side, who supported her at every step, had now decided to disappear, leaving her to her own fate. Meanwhile, the revelation about her lover still burned like fire beneath her skin, an open wound that wouldn't heal no matter how hard she tried to ignore it. Sophie tried to rationalize what she felt, trying to convince herself that she was a victim, that she was fragile, vulnerable to manipulation, but the truth imposed itself, hard and implacable. There were no innocents in that story. She was an adult, she was aware, she had made her choices. He had decided to believe the lies he was told, he had chosen to close his eyes to all the signs that screamed his way. The reality was that the pain of betrayal was not just in having been deceived by that man, but mainly in realizing how much she had betrayed herself. Shame made her avoid any social contact, refusing invitations, inventing excuses for not meeting friends or coworkers. He felt that everyone around him already knew, or if they didn't know, they would soon discover the story of his downfall. Every look, every innocent comment seemed to carry a silent judgment, a condemnation she believed she fully deserved. Sophie no longer recognized herself, the cheerful, confident woman who used to face the world with courage now hid behind closed doors, fearing any interaction that would remind her of who she had been before that fatal mistake. It was in this absolute isolation that the phone finally rang. Sophie shivered at the lit screen, fearing what she might find on the other end. He hesitated for a moment, but ended up giving in to his curiosity and answered, his voice barely coming out of his throat. It was the lawyer that Daniel had brought, a man with a firm, direct and emotionless tone. He had news that could make the already catastrophic situation in which she found herself even worse. Her lover had been located and arrested, accused of several financial crimes, scams against vulnerable women, including large-scale fraud. The lawyer warned that the authorities would like to talk to her. Sophie felt her blood run cold in her veins. What she thought was the bottom of the well now seemed to have a hidden trapdoor, revealing an even deeper and more terrifying drop. His first reaction was absolute panic. How could I face something like that? How could I look investigators in the eye and admit all that? Her private life, her most intimate mistakes would be publicly exposed, making her a ridiculous and pathetic victim in the eyes of anyone who heard her story. But at the same time, she sensed an opportunity of sorts. Perhaps this was the time to face the consequences of one's actions head-on, perhaps it was the time to assume, for the first time, one's complete and true responsibility for everything that had happened. On the day scheduled to give a statement, Sophie gathered all the courage that still remained in her torn heart and went to the police station. Every step taken in that cold corridor seemed to echo infinitely in her mind, reminding her that from now on nothing would be the same. When she entered the interrogation room, the officers' stern gazes fell on her with an intensity that almost made her flinch. They had precise questions, questions that forced her to revisit every moment she desperately tried to forget. As she recounted the sordid details of her extramarital relationship, she felt overcome with an unbearable mixture of humiliation and regret. At the end of her testimony, an investigator asked with calculated coldness if she had anything to add that could help uncover other victims, or even reduce their possible involvement in the crimes committed by her lover. Sophie took a deep breath and, for the first time since it all started, decided to no longer protect herself with half-truths or excuses. He admitted everything openly, gave names, places, dates. She spared no details, as she knew that this was the only way to begin to free herself from the emotional prison in which she had placed herself. Hours later, alone again, the feeling was strange. Although she still felt pain, shame and regret, something different was also beginning to emerge within her, the subtle, almost imperceptible feeling of relief. Not because he was free from the consequences, as they were still overwhelming, but because he finally took control of his own story. For the first time in a long time, I felt that perhaps there was still a possible path, a direction to be taken after all that emotional destruction. But Sophie knew the real challenge was yet to come. Justice would take its course, legal consequences would be inevitable, and social judgment would possibly last forever. However, what scared her most was knowing that she had deeply hurt the only man who had ever truly loved her, someone whose absence was now painfully felt in every inch of her life. The doubt that hung over her was whether there was still any room for redemption or forgiveness, or whether she would be condemned to carry the weight of her mistake forever. However, in the midst of the devastation, an idea began to slowly sprout in his wounded heart. Maybe it was possible to learn from suffering, maybe there was still a chance, however small, to try to become someone better after this personal catastrophe. It was no longer just about winning Daniel back or getting her old life back, but finding out who she could be from now on. This possibility, still fragile and uncertain, seemed enough to give him the strength to move forward, despite all the chaos left behind. That night, as she sat alone in the dark of her empty apartment, Sophie promised herself that she would no longer run away, that she would no longer try to erase the mistakes she had made. He would face its consequences with courage, regardless of the price he had to pay for it. But most of all, she promised that she would find a way to ask forgiveness from the only person whose opinion still mattered to her, Daniel. Even if he never accepted, even if he rejected her forever, she knew she needed this to have peace with herself. But destiny still had a surprise in store for Sophie. Something unexpected that would change everything again. A moral dilemma was about to arise, calling into question everything she thought she knew about herself, about justice, and about the true meaning of forgiveness. And this time, Sophie would no longer have any room for error. The following weeks were marked by relentless loneliness, an uncomfortable silence that Sophie learned to tolerate with bitter resignation. His life was now limited to mechanical movements, empty days and sleepless nights. The only constant presence in his life was deep and incessant regret, which did not give him rest for even a moment. To survive, she had thrown herself into her work with an almost obsessive intensity, trying to occupy her mind with reports, meetings, and anything else that gave her the slightest sense of control. However, no amount of activity was enough to silence the voices that echoed inside her head, constantly reminding her of what she had lost, of the price she had paid for her choices. One particularly cold morning, as he was organizing documents on his desk, the phone rang again. This time, it was a feminine voice, calm and confident, that called her by her full name with a formality that made her skin crawl. The woman identified herself as the prosecutor responsible for the case involving her ex-lover. She requested an urgent meeting, as a new victim had emerged, and it was essential that Sophie attend to provide additional clarification. The impact of that news shook her deeply. She agreed, even though she knew it would mean reliving all that pain again. The idea of once again confronting her own mistakes and facing someone who had gone through the same torment was something that deeply disturbed her. However, it was necessary to face all of this to achieve some kind of future peace. Upon arriving at the prosecutor's office, Sophie was taken to a small room where another woman was already sitting silently with her hands clasped in her lap. Seeing her, Sophie felt a profound shock. The woman before her was someone she knew superficially, a former college classmate, someone she had lost contact with years ago. The recognition was mutual and silent, and they both exchanged a look of painful understanding. It was as if a bridge had been established between them, built on the rubble of a shared yet unexpected pain. After the brief presentations, the prosecutor left them alone for a few minutes, stating that they could talk before the official testimony. The other woman was the one who broke the silence first, her trembling voice revealing the fragility of her situation. She began to tell her story, the details cruel and almost identical to what Sophie had experienced. As she spoke, tears rolled silently down her face, reflecting a pain that Sophie recognized all too well. With each word spoken by the woman, Sophie felt her heart tighten even more, realizing for the first time that the man's reach went beyond the individual suffering she had experienced. It was much bigger than I had initially imagined. After a few minutes of listening to the woman's devastating account, Sophie felt compelled to speak too. Not just about her experience with him, but also about the deeper consequences that mistake had caused her. He talked about the lost marriage, the shame, the crushing loneliness, and how everything seemed to have become an endless nightmare. As Sophie shared her pain, she noticed an expression of empathy appearing on the woman's face, who, silently, seemed to understand each feeling described. The conversation was interrupted by the prosecutor, who entered the room again, indicating that it was time for official statements. As Sophie walked to the courtroom, she felt an unexpected strength within her. It wasn't just courage, but a deep determination that this would be the moment when she would truly begin to repair some of the damage she had caused, not only to herself, but also to other victims. As Sophie sat before the judge and lawyers, she did something unexpected even for herself. Instead of just answering the questions that were asked of her, she addressed the court directly, clearly and sincerely exposing the entire process of emotional manipulation that she had suffered, but without exempting herself from the responsibility that she knew was hers as well. His words were firm, direct, painfully honest, revealing a maturity that seemed to be born at that very moment. Upon leaving the hearing, emotionally exhausted, Sophie was surprised again by the woman who was waiting for her in the hallway. With a weak, genuine smile, she reached out a hand to Sophie, squeezing it tightly. It was in that brief moment that they both realized the healing power of sharing their pain. Sophie felt, for the first time since the separation, a kind of lightness, as if she had relieved some of the burden on her shoulders by helping someone who was equally hurt. That night, as Sophie reflected on everything that had happened in court, she realized that there was something more that needed to be done, something that she had been putting off for too long. He decided it was time to try to talk to Daniel again, not to try to recover the relationship, as he knew that this was a closed chapter, but to ask for forgiveness for the suffering caused and, above all, to free him from any doubts that might remain about the feelings he still had for him. With shaking hands, he dialed the number he knew by heart, fearing the possibility of hearing only silence or a recorded message. To his surprise, after a few rings, Daniel answered, with a tired but firm voice. Sophie felt her heart sink at that familiar tone, fighting to control her tears as she tried to organize her thoughts. It didn't take long for her to get straight to the point, bluntly expressing that she wasn't looking for justification, but rather clearly saying how sorry she was for everything, asking only for a minimal chance of being heard. Daniel listened patiently, without interrupting her, letting Sophie get out everything she needed to say. When she finally finished, silence returned for a few seconds, before he finally spoke with a voice full of contained emotion. He thanked her for her sincerity, confessing that although he still felt pain and hurt, he appreciated the gesture and understood how difficult it had been for her to take that action. Then, unexpectedly, he said something that Sophie hadn't expected to hear. He had also thought a lot about everything and no longer held a grudge. "I couldn't forget, but I no longer felt anger or desire for revenge." He just wanted to move on with his life, and he wished she could do the same too. That conversation, even short, was enough to give Sophie a new and powerful feeling, a kind of initial redemption that she hadn't even imagined possible. It was the first real step towards healing, towards rebuilding her own life, away from the ghosts that still haunted her. When they hung up the phone, Sophie felt a deep relief, realizing that although she still had a long road ahead of her, she had finally found the starting point on a path to something better. However, just when Sophie was beginning to believe that things could really be right, she received one last message on her cell phone that made her freeze again. It wasn't a threat, not even something coming from that man who had ruined so many lives, but something unexpected, something that would put her face to face with an extremely difficult decision, capable of changing the entire course of her life once again. A dilemma that would make Sophie question everything she thought she understood up until that moment, and that would forever define who she really was, or who she could still become. It was a definitive moment, in which there would be no margin for error and no possible return. After receiving that last message, Sophie felt her heart freeze inside her chest, unable to take her eyes off the bright screen that displayed a desperate cry for help. The message came from the woman he had met in court, the one who had shared the same pain, the same cruel fate. Her ex-lover, even in prison, had found dark ways to get revenge on the witnesses who helped convict him, and now, that woman's life was in serious danger. Sophie realized that the decision made at that exact moment was not just about her past, but would completely define the future she wanted to build from now on. She took a deep breath and decided, finally, to face what was still pending in her life. With courage she never imagined she possessed, Sophie sought out the prosecutor again, handing over all the information she had received. The authorities quickly acted, managing to protect the threatened woman and reinforcing the conviction of her former lover. Now, there was no chance of him escaping or hurting anyone else. By facing her fear and exposing herself again to justice, Sophie understood that she was finally walking a true path, even if difficult. A deep feeling of liberation took over her, something that can only be experienced after definitively facing one's own ghosts. At the same time, Daniel was trying to rebuild his life in the best way possible. Despite the deep scars, time had brought him enough serenity to allow himself new encounters and experiences. In one of these chance encounters, he met someone who rekindled a hope in him that he thought had been lost. Laura was a woman with a difficult past, marked by experiences similar to his, but who carried within her a contagious joy, a surprising strength. Before long, the connection between the two became strong and sincere, allowing them both to rediscover the genuine meaning of trust and love. Little by little, Daniel understood that perhaps that deep pain had been necessary to lead him to someone who could really share life with him in an honest and profound way. However, one last meeting was destined to take place. One rainy morning, months after the trial, Sophie and Daniel unexpectedly find themselves face to face in a small cafe in the city center. The initial shock gave way to a silence filled with complex feelings, averted gazes, and palpable discomfort. But this time, Sophie found the strength to speak first, thanking Daniel for everything, not just for the past they had, but mainly for the hard lesson that his departure had taught him. He, with a calmness that surprised even himself, stated that there were no more resentments, that destiny had led them to different paths, but that they both deserved to be truly happy. Sophie smiled discreetly when she noticed the softness and peace in Daniel's eyes, a peace she hadn't seen in him for a long time. He wished him genuine happiness, knowing that it was a definitive but necessary goodbye. When they both said goodbye with a brief handshake, there was no doubt left between them, only mutual respect for having survived the worst moment of their lives. Sophie knew that this meeting symbolized the definitive closure of a painful story, but full of valuable lessons. Fate, however, had not finished surprising her. As she left the cafe, Sophie saw a message on her phone, this time from the woman she had recently helped. It was an invitation to an event about victims of abusive relationships, an opportunity for her to share her story and help others who might be going through similar situations. Despite her initial fear, Sophie felt that this was exactly the chance she was looking for to give deep and true meaning to the suffering she had faced. That night, in front of dozens of people seeking strength to overcome their own pain, Sophie openly shared every detail of her journey, from the wrong choices to the difficult decision to take responsibility for each of them. When she finished speaking, emotionally, she realized for the first time that perhaps all that chaos had happened precisely to get her there, on that stage, able to use her experience to prevent other people from repeating the same mistakes. The feeling was indescribable, as if he was finally beginning to write a new chapter of his life, far from the shadows of the past. Time passed, and each person followed the path their decisions led to. Sophie has become an important reference in the fight against abusive relationships and emotional blows, using her story as a powerful banner for awareness and change. Daniel, in turn, found a true partner in Laura, someone who made him smile easily again, capable of transforming even the most difficult memories into stories that strengthened them even more as a couple. As for the man who caused so much pain, his arrest has become final. Deprived of any power or influence, he was reduced to insignificance, condemned to face daily the irreversible consequences of the choices he had made throughout his life. His name became a warning symbol, a clear example of how wrong actions inevitably bring devastating consequences. And so, everyone involved found their own outcomes, each living the fair consequence of their choices. Life followed its natural course, clearly showing that, no matter how difficult it was, there was always a path to redemption and true happiness, as long as there was enough courage to face one's own truth. Now, it's your turn. Leave here in the comments what you thought of this story so intense and full of emotions. We really want to know your opinion, your reflections, and if you have ever known or experienced something similar. Also remember to subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications and share this story with your friends. And don't forget, here on the channel, we never support or encourage any type of betrayal. These stories are exclusively fictional and serve to clearly show how betrayals are capable of destroying lives and dreams. Always respect those by your side, and value honesty above all else. Thank you very much for watching, and until the next impactful story here on the channel.